We just have a little bit left in Chapter 8, a few odds and ends. One thing we need to discuss is ratio analysis. Just like in inventory, when we had inventory turnover and we were interested in knowing how quickly our inventory was turning over and becoming cash, now becoming sales. Now we're talking about receivables, and what we're interested in here is how quickly we can turn receivables into cash. And you really do want to get the receivables turned into cash, because one thing about these accounts receivable is they don't earn interest. So we want to have the cash coming in. If you have cash coming in, what you can do with that cash is you can take the cash, buy more inventory, sell the inventory, make your gross profit. And so it's a very good thing if we get our receivables paid early. We also learned previously that if the accounts aren't being paid, if accounts receivables aren't being paid in a timely fashion, it's more likely that they will go bad and be uncollectible. We had that in the aging of accounts receivable. So this accounts receivable turnover ratio, like our inventory ratios, are numbers that we look at when we're managing the company, also numbers that our investors look at too. Another number we have is days to collect, or how long it takes to collect our receivables. It's an interesting number here, because if we know what our terms are on our accounts receivable, or when our customers should be paying us, then we can compare that to when we actually do collect with this days to collect number, and we can determine if our customers are doing what they should be doing. You would not expect the days to collect number to be the same as according to the terms on the accounts receivable, because some customers, again, are not going to pay us on time. But you would expect it to be close. The receivables turnover is net sales revenue on the top and average net receivables. In the previous PowerPoint, I said that when we're doing our turnover for our inventory, we should average inventory, and I said you take the beginning and ending and divide by 2. You're going to do the same thing with receivables. You're going to take the beginning and ending and divide by 2. So our receivables turnover is how many times it turns over within this accounting period, and it does 10 times. So this is pretty good. If you take that 10 times, and if this is for a year, you can go down and take 365 days divided by the receivable turnover ratio you just calculated, and you see that it takes 36.5 days to collect. Again, if you're billing them 30 days after they make a purchase, you're saying you're collecting it in 36.5 days. And you have to allow also time for mailing it out and the customer receiving it in and the customer processing their check. So 36.5 is really good. It really is. On average, the way statements are sent out, it's on average 15 days after a sale. So it's not exactly 30 days. That's not technically the way it works. You'll get put into a cycle, and then they'll use this procedure, and so really the comparison is probably not 30 but 15. Still, 36.5 is a very good number. So when you sell an account, you can compare it to the number of days which you have in your terms or your stated policy. You can also compare different companies, and you can see that here VF turns over 8.8 times, Kellogg's turns over 10.3, and Skechers turns over 8.4 times. And it also translates then, another way of looking at it is in the days to collect, which is really a kind of an inverse, because you put this receivable turnover calculation in the denominator when you do the calculation. And so, yes, this is the best here, Kellogg's, for receivables turnover. And since the numerator is the same for each one of these, then also the days to collect calculation is also best using Kellogg's. So Kellogg's collects in 35.4 days on average, which is really good. Now, sometimes you want cash and you don't have cash. Your company has a definite need for cash because you have to go out and buy inventory. You're going to have to pay for inventory. So what could you do about your accounts receivable to turn it into cash quicker? Instead of waiting for the customer to pay off their cash account for their accounts receivable and send you their check for their accounts receivable, you can go to a company and you can sell your accounts receivable to them. So this is kind of an interesting concept then. What the factor is, the one that would be buying our accounts receivable would be doing is they would pay us the cash today, but they're going to subtract a little bit from it. There's several reasons why they're going to subtract from it. We already know that sometimes the customer's not going to pay. So they wouldn't pay us 100% on our accounts receivable, knowing that some of the customers are not going to pay off their balances. The other thing is the time value of money, or the interest rate factor. They're giving us cash today instead of us having to wait maybe a month or a month and a half to get the cash. So they're going to charge us something like interest. And so therefore we're not going to get 100% of our receivables balances when we sell our receivables. There's going to be a fee associated with it. But we could do this. We could do this factoring our receivables, and it gets us the cash in. And maybe we want cash in to build up our inventory. Another thing which we could do is we could not have receivables anymore, but require the customer to use PayPal or a credit card. This is something which Home Depot has been doing. It used to be at Home Depot you could go in and you could be a contractor and you could make a purchase and put it on your account. And Home Depot got away from that. And they said, we don't want to take on this credit risk. We don't want to have to think about whether you're going to pay us when it becomes due. We don't want to have to worry about that at all. Instead, we're going to make you take it to your credit card company or put it on a charge sale. Then the credit card company will pay us immediately. We will get the cash right away. So Home Depot, whenever a customer comes in and makes a purchase on their credit card, Home Depot gets that cash in their checking account the next day. Very quick. So not having to wait. And they need the cash, they get it quicker this way. This is a way to speed up collections. It's also a way for Home Depot to not to have to worry about the customer not paying us later. As is noted here also, it reduces loss from the customers writing bad checks. So if we say we're not going to take a check from you, you have to put it, either pay for it with cash, that'd be coins, currency, or you have to put it on your credit card. Then you don't have to worry about bad checks either. So credit card sales are an option, quite popular. Now I do need to tell you though that if a customer pays for it on a credit card, puts it on a credit card, Home Depot is not going to get in 100% of that sale in cash that next day. The credit card company is going to reduce it a little bit. Sometimes it's 2%, sometimes it's 3%. It really depends on the volume that the Home Depot has, but they won't pay us 100% of the sales amount. Now, the allowance account, this is kind of wrapping things up for our chapter. When we use this allowance account, or we estimated bad debt and we did it at the end of an accounting period right before we did our financials, so we did our financials except we need to put in this matching, or we need to put in bad debt expense. Well, you don't have to do that if you can show the bad debt expense is not a material amount or a big amount for your company. If you can show it's not a big amount for your company, then you can use what's called the direct write-off method. The direct write-off method has you writing off that accounts receivable, which is crediting the accounts receivable, and instead of taking it to the allowance account, you're going to take it directly to bad debt expense. That's because if bad debt is not a big amount for your company, you're not estimating bad debt expense at the end of an accounting period. So therefore, when you write off the account, you just take it to bad debt expense. So instead of having the two journal entries that you would expect with uncollectible accounts, you have one journal entry because you skip the estimation journal entry and you kind of combine the two entries together and you just record bad debt expense as the accounts are going bad, and you credit those accounts when they become bad. This is not GAAP. It is not acceptable for GAAP, but you can do it if the amount is not big, if it's not a great amount. So let's say your company doesn't have very much in accounts receivable sales. They just hardly have any accounts receivable sales. Almost all their sales are either credit card or cash sales. Well, then you could use a direct write-off method. You could not record bad debt expense. So in the period when you have the credit sales, you would not have any bad debt expense showing up. However, in a later period, if any of those accounts that related back to the sales which occurred in the first period do go bad, then you record the bad debt expense. So again, there's no bad debt expense allowance for uncollectible account journal entry, which is done in the period when you have the credit sales. Instead, you're going to go over to the period in which it's deemed or it's determined that the customer is not going to pay, then you record the bad debt expense. This is not GAAP, and you can see here why it's not GAAP. It's because there's no matching. There's no bad debt expense being recorded in the period when you had that credit sale. So it's not GAAP. However, if the credit sales numbers are very, very small, then that means if we used the allowance method and recorded bad debt expense, it would also be a very small number. For example, we had 0.75% in our problems. 0.75% of a very small number would be a very, very small number, and therefore it would not be significantly different from 0, right? So you can get away with the direct write-off method if you don't have very much in accounts receivable, or if your bad debt amounts are going to be very, very small. And that's called immaterial. If bad debt expense is an immaterial amount, you can get away with it. Most companies are not going to be able to get away with it. Most companies, I think, as I said before, will experience 3 to 5% in bad debt expense or uncollectible accounts. Therefore, most companies cannot use a direct write-off, and it is generally not acceptable for GAAP. So this is the direct write-off method then. Wait until the customer account is deemed to be uncollectible. Who's determining this? The credit department. They say we cannot collect on this account. Then you record the bad debt expense. And again, this is not GAAP. Direct write-off is not GAAP, but you can get away with doing it even though it's not GAAP as long as it's not a material amount.